Oh my goodness. Okay, I won't start over. Her research and writing on the game of Mahjong has been featured by NPR, the Wall Street Journal, Time.com, and Hong Kong South China Morning Post, among others. Her book, Mahjong, A Chinese Game and the Making of Modern American Culture, was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. It was the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch Award for the best first book in any historical subject, and it was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award for nonfiction. In her book, Annelise charts the cultural history of Mahjong, from American expats living in Shanghai to the US-wide Mahjong craze of the 1920s, to American Chinatowns in the 1930s, to Jewish American suburban enclaves and Catskills resorts in the 40s and 50s, and to Air Force officers' wives clubs of the 50s and 60s. Interesting cross-cultural migration. So without further ado, let's hear from Annelise about this very American game and Chinese game of Mahjong. Two notes. Please hold your questions until after Annelise has finished her presentation. And unfortunately, for those who are online and not here in person, you will not be able to see the slides that Annelise has prepared for us. So I apologize. Oh, maybe
It's working.
it's working. Yes, you will get to see the slideshow. Great. So everybody gets to see the slideshow today.
We planned all that just to build a system.
Okay. Annelise.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, Tawanda, for coordinating this visit. It's really a delight to get to be in person as well as speaking to people online, and especially in my home state of Oregon. So thank you. And so to start us off, I'll be sharing, as Wanda said, just a kind of brief overview of different snapshots into the history, but there's a lot more to say. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have, and I encourage you to share your own Mahjong stories or memories at the end. I really love getting to hear, how people are connected with the game. I also brought a little show and tell of a set here from the 1960s, and you're very welcome to come up and enjoy the beauty of the old tiles and the colorful racks that came with it. So we'll be talking a little bit about sets like this. But there's a big question that animates my book and that probably brought some people here today, and that is, how did a Chinese game shape modern American culture? And I know that most of the people here are probably quite familiar with Mahjong, but I never like to assume knowledge. But just before we get started, if you could raise your hand if you are a Mahjong player today. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you maybe grew up around Mahjong in some way, but don't necessarily play it, but might have some other kind of familiarity with it. All right, welcome. Well, that's great. So we've got a wide mix here. And so for those who aren't familiar with the game, it is a Chinese game of skill played by 4 people with tiles, which you can see here and here, instead of cards. And the traditional version of the game is that players make specific combinations of tiles, and it's often compared to the card game Gin Rummy. That's the most parallel game to the traditional game. And rather unusually, it can be played as a gambling game for very, very high stakes, but it can also and has always been played as more of a parlor game for very, very low stakes. And that's really unusual for a game to be able to traverse this kind of spectrum of a gambling game or not a gambling game, and that shapes its cultural and social history. So The tiles, which you can see here, make suits somewhat akin to a deck of cards. And so that is related to then, in these various styles of play, how players make different combinations of tiles. I won't be talking much more about the details of how to play today, but there are doubtless people in the audience here who could teach anyone who is interested in learning if you don't know it already. Now, the question I'm asked most frequently about this is how I came to the topic. And as Wanda mentioned, I played my first game of Mahjong in southwestern China when I was living there for a year. And I'm not in the picture because I'm the one taking the photo. This is in 2007. And this is when a friend taught me the very basic Chinese version of the game that her grandfather, who was from Shanghai, taught her. And as anyone who has interacted with the game knows, the sensory aspects really captured me right away. The way the tiles sound, the clicking of on the table as you wash or shuffle the tiles and gather your hand, the way that the tiles look, the way they feel, they're smooth and cool and heavy. And each set is unique. Each set tells its own story. And as I traveled through China, I saw Mahjong everywhere, and I saw how it brought people together. And this is a picture of 4 shop workers playing in the street outside on their break. And this is actually 3 women and a man. He's the one sensibly wearing a sun hat. And although what is today called American Mahjong is primarily a women's game, in China, both men and women regularly play the game, and they play it separately in sex-segregated games or together, and they might play it old and young mixed together, or also age-differentiated games. This is really, again, woven into lots of different aspects of the fabric of life. And while I was living in China, my aunt visited me, and she wanted to know why her Jewish friends in Denver, Colorado, played what was obviously a Chinese game. And it was not an obvious connection. I honestly thought that I could just look it up on Google, someone would have answered. And I found that a lot of people had asked that very question. And there were a lot of myths and theories, a lot of misinformation that was widely circulated. But no one had done the scholarly historical research to find out. And when I scratched the surface, I discovered a whole wealth of sources and stories associated with the game's past 100 years in the United States. And I quickly discovered that there was this enormous international and fad in the 1920s that I'll talk more about. But searching for sources like this brought me to old newspapers in English and Chinese, oral histories with wonderful folks like Hilda Schaefer, who we'll come back to later. And this is just kind of a pastiche of snapshots of the different kinds of stories and sources I found in what was really a kind of needle in the haystack search. There is no archive for Mahjong. I'm very happy to say that now, because of my research, the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, now has a Mahjong collection, but they didn't when I started this project. And so my project really took me on a kind of adventure of finding this stuff. And I went to a former Parker Brothers factory where there was an old room covered in dusty old games right off of the factory floor. I interviewed the daughter of one of the National Mahjong League's founders and found her mother's scrapbooks from the 1930s, and conducted dozens of personal interviews, like with Hilda Schaefer, with people who were generous enough to share their memories. And I really am so grateful to everyone who spoke with me about their and their family stories with the game. So let's begin with a brief introduction to the origins of the game. Mahjong evolved as one of many mostly male gambling games in the area around Shanghai in the mid to late 1800s. And it became part of the cosmopolitan nightlife scene, which you can see here in a print from the 1890s in a courtesan hall, which was an important part. Courtesans were an important part of the Shanghai social network at the time. And it became increasingly popular among the growing number of American businessmen and expatriates who lived in Shanghai at the turn of the 20th century, and especially after World War I. Matrons and single women played an essential role in integrating Mahjong into expatriate social patterns, right? Hosting Mahjong events and gatherings, playing after dinners. And they would also write letters home to their families in the United States talking about this game. And a number of individuals, most famously and most importantly, a Standard Oil representative named Joseph Park Babcock, successfully imported Mahjong to the United States via California in 1922 and marketed it all over the country. And far beyond his wildest dreams, this game took off like wildfire. And this is an advertisement that's really typical of these fad years in the early 1920s that emphasized the kind of misty exoticism that surrounded the game, right? This is an image here of white women dressed in both fashionable clothes and Chinese-inspired robes. This is what sets looked like in the 1920s, this kind of chest of drawers. And here you can see they marketed it as Mahjong with the double G. And that double G was meant to emphasize its exoticism. And so it was really advertised both, again, as this kind of appealing allure of the, quote, Orient, but also as a sophisticated game of wealthy socialites that could compete with the popular card game of bridge. That was really a dominant game at the time. And so soon, the most elite Americans, from President and First Lady Harding in the White House to Hollywood celebrities in the early Hollywood, were all playing it. And so Americans started just purchasing thousands and thousands of these sets. And it actually started spreading then in other places around the world. And so European royalty began playing the game. It also took off in Japan. Japan was one of these foreign powers that was also part of the Shanghai semi-colonial scene at the time. And so just 2 years after its introduction, Americans made Mahjong sets Shanghai's 6th largest export to the United States. And in 1924, Congress generally cut taxes, but they added a tax law specifically targeting Mahjong sets because it was such a huge import. And so this moment when Americans are also helping spark a global consumer fad, particularly in Europe, is a really remarkable and interesting shift and speaks to the growing cultural power of the United States at in the early 20th century, and particularly after World War I, when Americans had previously always followed Europeans' lead as consumer tastemakers, and particularly with things from China, like tea or China itself, right? Porcelain. Those are all patterns that were established in Europe first. So this is a change. And it's one way we can see these other broader patterns. Now, as this huge market took off and again was consuming thousands and thousands of sets, in 1923, Chinese and Western merchants launched new kinds of large-scale factories in Shanghai that combined a handcrafted manufacturing process with streamlined production. And you can see the caption here is first process in making Mahjong, cutting shin bones from USA. So there was such a huge boom in production that Chinese factories and workshops quickly ran out of the domestic supply of cow bone, which is what they were using to carve tiles at the time. So they began importing huge amounts of cow bone out of Chicago, shipped through Galveston, Texas. So steamships would have crossed paths with steamships exporting the raw material of bones to China, China would have crossed paths with steamships, importing then the finished product of Mahjong sets back to American consumers. And in this window of time during the fad years, the global price of bone skyrocketed more than 2,000%. So it's really, again, got these measurable economic impacts. So the fad was truly across groups of class and race, and also across region. But what newspapers emphasized over and over again was an urban game played by white socialites in Chinese costume, or really what they imagined to be particularly ancient royal Chinese costume. And they were often inspired by what they saw in representations of Chinese opera. And that included women like this society matron in Los Angeles, as well as a Vanderbilt daughter who starred in a Mahjong themed ballet in New York City. And she is representing a flower tile. And middle-class housewives in Atlanta who read this article explaining how to host a Chinese-themed luncheon, which was, quote, all the rage. So in this period, one of the consistent things you see are white women in ornate Chinese costumes. And one of the things I talk about in the book is trying to understand why that was happening. And I talk about how it served to allow them to experiment with exotic personae and push new boundaries of respectable femininity and sexuality in an area when those boundaries were really rapidly changing. Again, this is the 1920s kind of jazz age. And the Mahjong craze hit at the same time in American culture that there was a full takeoff of mass marketing techniques. And that's part of how this craze was enabled. So that included advertising and catalogs, store displays, and Mahjong wasn't all of it. And you can see here, this is an image from the Los Angeles department store Bullock's. And here, again, is a white sales girl dressed in Chinese costume. And she's there to usher in customers for a newly immersive kind of shopping experience. This is, again, a kind of new marketing technology, are these department store experiences, or what at the time would have been called a, quote, trip to the Orient, right? Come to Bullock's and have a trip to the Orient through these consumer goods. And that was really part of what I talk about as consumer Orientalism, which is a set of ideas and assumptions that Americans and Europeans held about people in the, quote, East, right? And it was just the East lumped all together. So that would have been a mishmash of Chinese and Japanese and Middle Eastern goods and items and cultural elements that was, again, kind of just lumped together in a way that was very typical of the dominant culture at the time. And the store's experience, the store's goal, rather, was to use that experience to sell Mahjong sets, which you can see here in this glass case. Now, from its introduction into American society, newspapers, advertisers, and popular media consistently discuss Mahjong as an embodiment of authentic Chinese culture. But a lot of that discussion was really rooted in stereotypical understandings. Americans, for the most part, really didn't know much about China. And most importantly, Americans have a long history of seeing the defining feature of Chinese people and the, quote, Far East in general as being inherently different from Westerners. And that's connected to that idea of Orientalism that I was just mentioning. And we see real life effects of that in that with immigration law in particular, where until 1952, Chinese and Japanese Americans could not naturalize into citizenship. They could not become naturalized citizens, no matter how long they had lived in the United States, because of this idea of unassimilability, that they would remain inherently perpetual foreigners. And so those ideas are also part of what lent, again, in a consumer context, this sense of excitement, otherness. this exciting otherness, right? This exoticism. Now, the 1920s are remembered as a kind of carefree, freewheeling jazz age, but it was also an era of deep contradictions and was also a deeply racist era. So the 1920s Mahjong craze being of its era, many of the advertisements and jokes and songs and plays that surrounded this craze involved a lot of racist caricatures and stereotypes. And I'm not going to show those images because I don't want to perpetuate them and circulate them further. But I'm showing this picture of the Ku Klux Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1925 as an indication of that kind of mainstream strength of the revitalized the Klan in the 1920s. And you can see, right, they're not wearing masks. There is no attempt to hide. The Klan is animated around widespread and widely shared nativist ideas that were very opposed to Catholics, Jews, African Americans, and anti-Asian sentiment as well, right? So again, this was part of the larger context that pervaded the game's introduction to the United States. So how do we understand this time also as a massive, enormous fad about a game that was specifically, because it was Chinese, in this also very strongly anti-immigrant era? And in part, a key part of it is about how marketers really used the complex and contradictory symbolism of China in American culture. Now, there were negative stereotypes of Chinese people as unsophisticated laborers or an association with kind of cheap chop suey, low quality, and ideas of tradition-bound backwardness, right? Like that they were opposite of a Western entrepreneurial spirit. But white Americans also held ancient China in high esteem as an earlier paragon of civilization, right? So there are these contradictory kind of tensions. There's a degradation, negative stereotypes associated with contemporary Chinese American immigrants and China, but an admiration of ancient royal China. And that is where this long-standing myth that you might have heard of Mahjong being an ancient game, that's why that myth was created, because marketers over and over and over again emphasized that this was a game of the ancient royal Chinese court. And this is a newspaper article, right? This isn't even an advertisement per se. It just becomes part of the widely accepted myths surrounding the game. This becomes, the understood truth. But Mahjong was in fact a modern game less than a century old, right? Mid to late 1800s, from this modern place of a very cosmopolitan place of Shanghai. But this very effective efforts to create a sense of excitement through exoticism while simultaneously distancing the game from Chinese American contemporaries worked. And so you see over and over again this kind of images of this court official called the Mandarin. Sometimes people would claim that Confucius invented it, or it was at the time of Confucius, right? None of those things are actually true. But it did work to create a culture in which white Americans could embrace a Chinese game while still rejecting Chinese people. And in fact, a competitor of Joseph Park Babcock's company was importing sets from China. One of his competitors was manufacturing Mahjong in the United States, and so was doing a lot of explicit argumentation that the game made in the United States was, quote, more authentic than the sets made in China because the Chinese had lost the great esteemed past, but he, as an American, he could actually make it better in the United States as authentic because he was claiming this ancient royal lineage. all of that, again, is completely rhetoric, it's manufactured, but you can see these really effective and widespread marketing techniques. Now, this fad wasn't just for or by white consumers. Chinese Americans both participated in the fad as consumers themselves. This is when most Chinese Americans learned Mahjong, if they were already in the United States, even as it was also wildly spreading in China because of this huge global fad where everybody's talking about this game as the quintessential, quote, national game of China. That spreads its popularity in China too. But most Chinese Americans hadn't known the game before these fad years, but they become a part of it both as consumers and as instructors. So in a context in which Chinese Americans could not often get hired in jobs that actually lined up with educations and degrees that they may have earned in American universities, right? Even if they had gotten a bachelor's degree in engineering or English, they were only able to be hired in the same kind of dead-end economic niches like restaurants and curio shops and kind of ghettoized businesses that their parents had. But in this fad period, they could market themselves, they could use those ideas of, quote, authenticity to actually get an opportunity to be paid very high wages to teach white Americans Mahjong, even though they had probably also just learned it in the United States. But they were able to say, oh no, you want this idea, right, of Chineseness, I'm now going to sell it to you. In a very discriminatory economy, that was a brief window of economic opportunity. Now, it was also, again, not only a fad apart from Chinese Americans, but really becomes an important part of Chinese American culture. And over the following decade, Mahjong then became part of this embedded dynamic that you can see also in the built environment or the landscape of Chinatown spaces that faced outwards to white consumers and inwards to Chinese Americans. And in that process, the game became established in that tension between inclusion and exclusion that defined much of the experience of Chinese American ethnicity in the early 20th century. And that's something I talk a lot more about in the book. And this is a photo from 1942 in a general store in Manhattan's Chinatown. And you can't see a Mahjong set in this image, but one is almost certainly there, either just under the counter or in this back room that you can just get a hint into. Very often, if you went into the back room of a general store, there would be tables of older men playing Mahjong. So the fad, the widespread fad, dies out definitely by the end of the 1940s, really even by the 1920s, even by the mid 1920s, it's starting to slow down. But pockets of players remain. Certainly, again, it has become embedded by that point and continues to grow among Chinese Americans, but also, again, just kind of regional groups continue playing. And one of them is linked then to a group based in New York that becomes a particularly influential driver of a specifically American variation. And this is in the late 1930s, right, 1937, a group of Jewish women in New York established the National Mahjong League to revitalize what they believe was a wrongfully neglected game, right? We're like, this is a great game. Everyone should still be playing this. And we're going to make it better so that everyone can agree on the same set of rules. Because part of what happened in the 1920s with all these marketers fighting among themselves is everybody's marketing a slightly different variation of the game that's supposedly the most authentic. And all these fights would erupt if you get together with friends about which way you were supposed to play. So their version was going to standardize the game, create one. And they really wanted to bring it back into widespread popularity. But what ended up happening was that they were most effective in creating a shared way of playing the game that spread among primarily Jewish women's networks. And this especially happens after World War II. So one of the founders of the league, Dorothy Meyerson, was especially important in developing and spreading the game. Meyerson was very media savvy. She was very entrepreneurial. She appeared on radio and even early television to teach people the game. And she and the other women who founded the league, they were all wealthier women. They not only didn't have to work to provide for themselves and their families, they would have lost status for themselves or their families if they had worked for wages, right? So they had this entrepreneurial drive and were channeling it. The league's game is what becomes known popularly as American Mahjong. But it's worth noting that there are more than 40 variations of Mahjong around the world today, and there are multiple specifically American variations. But the league's version, which Meyerson helps create the first version of, is really by far the most popular, what eventually becomes the most popular and widespread American specific variation. And one of the changes that they make is that over a series of years, they experiment with changes, that they create a smaller number of acceptable winning hands with more variations in combinations. And this is the National Mahjong League board in the 1960s. This is after then decades of experimentation and change. And it's the year that they introduce the Joker tiles, which becomes a significant shift and that marks the American game. They also, in another hallmark of the league's game, develop a rule card, right? So it's an annual rule card of acceptable winning hands. It changes from year to year. And this becomes a unique and defining element of the league's style of Mahjong. And because they're selling that card, and because these women are not working for wages, they quickly generate enough money that covers the expenses. And they use that extra funds to build a philanthropic element of the league, which also dovetails with long traditions of Jewish women's philanthropic efforts. And you can see that during the war, they used this, and still today continue to use the philanthropic elements as an advertising tool, right? Like, come, you can support the war effort, you can support refugee efforts by donating your Mahjong winnings, by hosting tournaments and galas, things like that. And really, the league's roots in philanthropy actually started even in its origins, where Dorothy Meyerson first sold her Mahjong book shortly before she helped found the league as a fundraiser for her synagogue. And then really, especially after the war, when everything was about the war effort, the league then continued to promote the game specifically as a patriotic tool. And in 1941, when things were already violent in Europe and Asia, but right before the US enters the war, the National Mahjong League convention theme was, quote, the vital part which Mahjong can play in giving women a greater role in democracy. Right? So it's really, again, making these big claims about this patriotic effort. So one other wartime expansion of the game, which I won't talk about right now, but I'm happy to answer questions about, and I talk more about in the book, is within military culture. So during the war, some members of the military and officers' wives began playing the 1920s style game again. And then during the war, specifically Air Force officers' wives, such as these women here, eventually developed their own version of the game, another specifically American variation, and that becomes named after the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. And their version, now known as Wright-Pat Mahjong, continues to be played on Mahjong on Air Force bases around the world. And you can see here, this is an image from the 1960s. They too are now, again, white women dressing up in Chinese-inspired costumes. This is kind of the latest version that you see of some of those original seeds in 1920s culture. But they have also specific winning hands. They name them. And oftentimes they have military themes like Pearl Harbor. This is the Pearl Harbor hand. This is the Independence hand. Things like that. Now, Dorothy Meyerson actually has a little connection here too, because she continued her own standalone Mahjong business even after she helped start the league. That causes some friction with her in the league, as you might imagine. But she sold Mahjong sets to Wright-Pat officers' wives players. And those sets, like this one here, were made now by New York manufacturers. So by the 1960s, the league's repeated changes, like adding jokers, had transformed the game enough that it required additional tiles and different rules. And so when the league codified its style of play in the 1930s and then really stabilized it by the 1960s, it marked the cultural and physical Americanization of the game. Which is a process that then continues in various ways. But importantly, even as sets like this and this one are made in New York factories out of plastic, they keep the consistently recognizable tiles that are often very close to those original 1920s Chinese-made sets. And that's part of what keeps it a recognizable form of action. The materiality has now moved from the 1920s bone and bamboo to 1950s and 60s plastic. Now, this explains part of how the National Mahjong League's game, or what we often call American Mahjong today, becomes part of especially middle-class Jewish American culture during the post-war years. But why does that happen, right? Just like we were talking about in the 1920s, paying attention to how something happened also doesn't help explain always why that happened. So we have to ask both questions. And the league is a crucial part of that answer. It would not have happened without the league. But it's also part of a broader story of middle-class Jewish American life after World War II. So a couple of hours north of New York City, the Catskills became an important place for Jewish families to retreat to during the sweltering summers. And this cultural elements that emerged in the Catskills were not happening only or uniquely in the Catskills. Catskills are especially important and influential in this story. And in these communities, the summer communities, women ran seasonal households amidst reduced domestic obligations. So mothers and children would stay all summer in these little cottages called bungalow colonies, and husbands would go back and forth for the weekends. And in the bungalows, domestic work continued, but it was much lessened. Children went to day camp, expectations for meals lowered. And as one woman who went to the Catskills as a girl told me, women played Mahjong, quote, all the time, really all the time. And you can see here, right, this is the lawns between the bungalows. There are, just, I love this photo, the color saturation, but also the feeling, right, that you get from this image. Now, in the Catskills and in other summer bungalow colonies, women could socialize like this during the day and at night, right, during the week, without actively making demands on their husbands or sacrificing their domestic duties. And that specific kind of summer rhythm and patterns then helped naturalize what became much more of an active carving out of rare time and space inside the 1950s home when husbands and children were present, but Mahjong kind of acted as a little bit of a wedge, so that there on Mahjong nights when women would host and rotate between each other's homes, those nights were just for the ladies. And this is how and why young Jewish mothers in particular forged American Mahjong culture during the 1950s and 60s. And that's part of a larger context of massive suburbanization and the baby boom and newfound upward mobility for many Jewish Americans. Regular weekly Mahjong games helped women, especially mothers of young children, build female-focused networks. And so this context of kind of suburbanization, Jewish Americans had new ability to access home loans in non-discriminatory ways, although some discrimination did continue in residential segregation. But they were able to access loans alongside Italian Americans in new ways, in contrast to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans, who, especially depending on region, would not have necessarily been able to access home loans. Jewish Americans and Italian Americans in the aftermath of World War II experienced some decline in discrimination and really massively accelerated their move into the middle class. And so Jewish women both experienced the possibility of increased economic stability and comfort, and the perils of increased potentially isolation. Jewish women had higher rates of higher education than women on average, but also higher rates of leaving the workforce to raise young children. And so at Mahjong nights, women, particularly again, young mothers, gathered around, kicked other family members out of that part of the house, cooked food that other family members were not allowed to eat. Somebody else put the kids to bed, and they drank coffee and ate coffee cake and smoked and talked about their families and enjoyed each other. And these are very unusual in that there were other kind of 1950s women's groups, but many times those were focused on volunteerism, PTAs, synagogue sisterhoods. And this was really just about leisure. This was just about fun. And it was a cultural norm. This happened across the country in Atlanta and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and Detroit. This is in Valdosta, Georgia. This in Brooklyn. And this photo is actually taken by Hilda Schaefer in her Brooklyn dinette. And groups across the country played the same game at parallel times and places while noshing on similar snacks. And in so doing, they also created a cultural touchstone for so many children who grew up in post-war Jewish American homes, who heard the clicking of their tiles and their mothers calling 1 bam, 3 dot, and laughing as they fell asleep. So in the midst of newly possible but still tenuous promises of integration and upward mobility, Jewish Americans confronted the risks of cultural loss, right? What did it mean to be entering these kind of waspy Protestant American suburbs that could come with assimilation? And before I say anything else, I want to make it clear that players approached Mahjong first and foremost as a game, right? No one was thinking, this is really serving my purposes as a woman who had just recently left the workforce and is moving into an increasingly suburban neighborhood and is aware that I might be experiencing cultural loss, right? No one is saying that. But what's happening as thousands of Jewish American women are doing this is that it became a marker of Jewish neighborhoods. And it was, especially in the context in which it was no longer widely popular, right? Most Christian Americans weren't playing Mahjong at this point, unless they were Chinese American. Mahjong also subtly demarcated space apart from the dominant Christian society. And Italian Catholics were sometimes integrated into Mahjong groups, but they were always being invited into a predominantly Jewish space. And so this image is interesting because it's a recent image by a young Jewish American artist who focuses on representations of the modern Jewish experience that he says, quote, ties us all together. So it's really interesting that Mahjong is one of those that he has identified. And so both Mahjong, it becomes associated with an evolving ethnic identity, and for mothers of young children living with the constraints of 1950s cultural expectations for women, it was often a lifeline of community. Now, the game's adaptability has created barriers as well as bridges, as players have pushed the evolution of distinctive Mahjong variants. With those more than 40 variations that exist around the world today, each of those express a unique history of adaptation, and each of them has shaped specific cultures of interaction and play. Mahjong's American history is rooted in the tension between inclusion and exclusion, as well as the risks of cultural erasure through appropriation or assimilation. Mahjong reveals the deeply American experience, sometimes desired and sometimes enforced, of simultaneously belonging and standing apart. So thank you so much. This is my contact information. Please feel free to be in touch afterward, but I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts as well. So thank you.
Was when American Mahjong was happening, was that the same time that Contract Bridge was happening? Was that controlling the controls were put in both of the games at the same time?
Good question. Contract Bridge really happens immediately upon the heels of that massive Mahjong fad. It happens a little bit earlier. And I have wondered, didn't dig into this part of history, so it's supposition on my part, but I've wondered if it was in part a reaction to the Mahjong fad, because there was explicit, like often tongue-in-cheek references, but explicit brawls between bridge players and Mahjong players. If it was like Mahjong's taking Bridge's fans, and in the 1920s, because of the context I talked about earlier, that was often with racist humor, right? This invading Chinese game is taking over the European game of bridge. But I think many players played both games. But I've just wondered if part of what pushed that change in bridge and a popularization of a new form was partially a reaction to.
I've always wondered if when women started to play it exclusively with other women, if they needed then to have somebody dictate the rules instead of the free flow of Chinese. I mean, it was reasonable.
Well, even in the 1920s version of the game, it pretty quickly becomes known as a women's game in the United States, even before. The National Mahjong League is not the group that makes it a women's game to begin with. In the American context, I didn't make this clear. I talk about it in the book. But in the American context, partially, I think, in large part, actually, I think because of those cultural stereotypes attached to Asian culture, and in this case specifically Chinese culture, so many white Americans associated Asia with femininity, and that was part of Orientalist ideas. And so what you see is all these white women dressing up in Chinese costume. You see almost no white men dressing up in Chinese costume. And the only ones who did were like a wrestler and a professional billiards player, right? Like these kind of icons of masculinity. So it was and then it builds on itself, right? You see all the images of society women dressing in Chinese costume. You're seeing about like how to host the luncheons, the advertisements, emphasize this kind of glamorous femininity. And so by the end of the fad, it is a women's game in the US when they're playing all these slight variations of the 1920s rules. I think the reason, right, and I will say that in the 1920s, there were also efforts to quote standardize the game, because often led by male bridge experts who are tired of all these people claiming that they knew the right way. They knew the right way. They were the experts, right? And those standardizations efforts failed. There were just too many cooks in the kitchen wanting to make money off of it. And Babcock was going around suing everyone who was selling something called Mahjong. So then they all started to try to like change it a little bit. Just, yeah, it fractured.
So in the 20s, when all these sets were being imported from China, did they have rules that came with the game? How did people learn how to play?
Great question. So Babcock's company, which then Parker Brothers purchases Babcock's company, he writes and copyrights the Little Red Book of Rules. This is before Mao's Little Red Book. It's kind of ironic. A highly capitalist Little Red Book was he sold it with all of his sets. And then eventually the Parker Brothers did that. But there were a proliferation of instruction manuals that, again, it's hard to overstate how much stuff was happening around Mahjong in the 1920s. There are many, many instruction books that come out. But really, if anyone has learned Mahjong from a book, well, let me know. But I think it's really hard to learn from a book. It's much easier to learn from someone. So what you have in actuality is a whole cottage industry of instructors. And a lot of those instructors, I talked about the economic opportunity for Chinese Americans. It was also an economic opportunity for single women when there weren't a lot of economic opportunities for single women. So they could they could teach other women in their homes, or they would, there was one woman who had lived in Massachusetts, but then like traveled the summer resorts where all the wealthy hung out. They'd pay her a lot to come down and stay for the summer and just teach Mahjong all the time. And she could make way more than she could by being like a teacher. Again, this is just a window of time, but you could really carve out some niches. And another major place that people learned were, just like I showed that picture of the Bullock's department store with the sales girl. Well, they would often have an instructor stationed, and then they would teach people for free with the idea that you would buy a set from them. But the store would pay that instructor.
So this fad or this craze was very short-lived.
Mm-hmm.
How many years and why?
Why decline? Yeah. It's a good question. It lasts for a few years. It's hard, like by 1925, you start seeing some articles that are like, Mahjong's over. That's a little bit premature. Definitely, by the time the stock market crashes in 1929, the fad is over by then. It's not the crash that ends the fad. It's done before then. So I think it's really, sometime between 25 and 29.
It has something to do with the advertising or the lack of it.
I think part of what happens, right, is a fad in part because of the excitement, and then the excitement wears off. So fads inherently are short-lived, but it's also, I think I also identify two other factors. One is that because it's a good game, right? People could have continued playing it just because it wasn't a fad anymore.
Well, and they still do.
And actually it's coming back. But not at the rates that it was. But it was, I think, in part because it was part of a cultural moment that was doing this various kinds. It tapped into something in particular to the 1920s, when Americans are seeing themselves as leaders of the world in new ways, and they're talking about themselves as modern in very new and self-conscious ways. People talk about themselves as moderns, as a noun, right? We are moderns. And part of that idea of modernity is all about these tensions and conflict between a move toward a more multiracial democratic society, at the same time that it is also built upon decades of anti-immigrant and white supremacist frameworks. And you have a move away from royalty at the moment that you have this huge disparity in wealth. So the elite kind of want to imagine themselves as royalty, right? Like there's all these kinds of tensions, and women in particular in gender roles are really changing fast. And the ideas of inhabiting this kind of like exotic personae are a part of those changes in gender that are happening by and for American women. So I think a lot of the answer is really about why it's a fad to begin with, the cultural reasons, and why that moment changes.
And everything changing so rapidly, just
Yeah,
generally
right,
speaking.
right.
Yeah.
But all those proliferations of competitors and all the infighting among the right way to play, that did not help. Yeah, I would love your question. Yeah, it's a great question, but I just want to make sure is there anybody else? Yeah.
How do you reconcile the bestsellerness of people like Sax Rohmer
Mm-hmm.
and Ernest Rama
Mm-hmm.
with this particular trend?
Yeah, so
in the Chinese,
you mean specifically Sax Rohmer with
like,
Fu
yeah,
Manchu?
like yellow
Yellow
peril
peril narrative,
versus admiration for
right,
ancient Chinese.
right.
Completely contradictory.
I think this is precisely part of that contradiction and tension, right? So the Fu Manchu character becomes a part of Mahjong marketing. Like one of the things that you see as this representation of Mandarins, they always look like Fu Manchu because it's part of this recognizable stereotypical iconography at that point of Chinese
Smart but evil
culture.
guy.
Smart but evil. And so within that that narrative, that's part of the kind of actual, like explicit rejection of this is not about contemporary Chinese culture. This is not about pro-Chinese laborers or immigration. It's certainly not about pro-lower class Chinese immigrants. It is about tapping into this idea of a kind of otherworldly mystique. And Fu Manchu is part of that too, right? There's this kind of like mystical brain powers. And so he's someone who you can kind of, there's a lot of excitement around, but it's totally divorced from actual Chinese culture and actual Chinese people. So there are ways that they work in tandem. But you're right that Fu Manchu and other stereotypes are explicitly negative, explicitly hostile. And that's actually part of the discourse around Mahjong too. So there are a lot of people who, in seriousness, particularly Christian ministers, are very, very, very concerned about Mahjong, in part as a gambling game, and in part with this kind of threat of insidiousness or vice that's associated with Chinese culture entering through this Mahjong game, that it becomes a kind of like, this is a Trojan horse, right?
Yeah, well, I don't see how they sell that idea. It's an American game at this point, especially the National Mahjong League rules.
I mean, and it's still a Chinese game.
Completely American.
But it's still a Chinese game. It will never not be a Chinese game.
Kind of. Yeah.
But you're right. That's the fear. But then it's a whole. This is the 1920s. This is also a time of massive boundary crossing and titillation. And so people love this idea of like, ooh, toe in, toe out. Toe in, toe out is dangerous. Oh, let's play with it. But we're not actually going to engage with it too much. We're going to consume it. We're going to play with it. We're going to try it on, and then we're going to take it off. And that's part of how this works. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the double G in Belgium.
Yes.
Whatever happened to it?
It's still around. It's, there are multiple totally accurate spellings of Mahjong. I spell Mahjong on the cover of my book, with one word, no double G, just because I see that as the most kind of neutral spelling that is universal, that crosses lots of cultural differences. But there are lots of ways of spelling the game in a transliterated English context. There's also a history of evolution of the game within Chinese itself. The original characters of the game's name are not actually the characters that are used now. And so each of those changes has a specific story that I'm happy to talk more about if you want to. It's also in the book. But that double G is still part of the official name of the National Mahjong League, and it's still associated with particularly American forms of the game. Yeah, sure, great. One more, yeah, sounds perfect.
I am wondering how the Chinese felt about American women dressing up in Chinese costumes and, taking on that.
Yeah, great question. Great question. So, it's interesting because Chinese voices in China and Chinese American voices engaging both in the US and across the Pacific actively respond to the explicit kind of racism associated with the game. Like what I was talking about with this American manufacturer who was like, I'm making the real Mahjong because these, he says very insulting things about Chinese people. This is like, people are writing in journals and in newspapers of this, how dare he say this? This is a Chinese game. He can't make it, nobody, the kind of, I think as indication of ways in which there has been what I would consider some cultural progress around the acceptability of explicit racism in the United States, which we are currently living in a moment where there is more explicit racism in the popular culture than there has been somewhat recently, but it's still not like it was in the 20s. There was casual racism was just deeply embedded in part of the framework of, and widely accepted as part of American culture at the time. So it was that was the concern when it was like explicitly racist. Concerns about things that we would today talk about as cultural appropriation were not measuring on the radar of this is something we really need to speak out about, because it was not a vile claim about Chinese culture or people. It was not actively hostile. I think there are lots of problems with it that we can talk about, particularly today, and we can talk about how that's actually rooted again in a kind of divorcing of this culture and game from actual Chinese people, right? It's reflective of a bunch of stereotypes, and but it is not active hostility. And that was where the concern was among Chinese Americans and Chinese people. And they also understood that the popularity of the game offered a real opportunity to try to improve the relationship between the US and China, and also improve ideas and understandings of Chinese people held by most Americans. So Chinese people and Chinese Americans definitely saw Mahjong as a kind of form of cultural diplomacy. Yeah.
I have a question from someone online.
Oh, great.
And she wants to know if you can share the relationship between canasta and Mahjong and jokers.
Oh, great. Yes, I love this. So raise your hand if you're a canasta player. Anybody a canasta player too? Okay, great. Yeah, there's strong crossover between Mahjong and canasta players. And there was in the 1940s. So 1940s, canasta was huge, very, very popular. It's really more of a game of luck. And as part of that, there are, jokers play an important role. At the time, so the National Mahjong League was actively engaged in trying to figure out, as part of their standardization efforts, how much to incorporate luck into the game. This has its roots in the 1920s fad, when flower tiles served as a kind of wild card. They were hugely controversial. Those bridge experts, they were writing very angrily about the use of flowers. And they were blaming women for using flowers. So big controversy about flower tiles. By the late 1930s, when the National Mahjong League is trying to standardize their version of the game, they're like, okay, we're going to integrate flowers. Flowers are luck. How many flowers should we use? And players are, they would have these conferences every year, conventions where players would like shout their opinions. And so that over a period of experimentation, at one point, they increase the number of flowers to like over 20. That's at one point, right? And people are like, no, it's way too much. It's way too much luck. And they would, because these manufacturers were in New York, and the National Mahjong League was in New York, they would just like mail extra tiles to their members. It was a very different scene. But they, because a lot of Mahjong players were canasta players as well, they started pushing for jokers, and in the early 1960s, the league created a new tile called jokers that would become the wild card. Flowers then would go back to being 8 tiles, serve a specific purpose that's different than the purpose it serves in the traditional game, and jokers then become a part of the American set, and they eventually they experiment with that number 2. But that's really, I think, a contribution of the canasta players. I don't have like a specific document that says that, but all the historical evidence points in that direction. Yeah.
Well, I'm intrigued by Air Force officers' wives.
Great. Yeah.
Because their husbands leave, and so
Right.
they're left with this time on their hands, and they're officers' wives, and so they were the elite.
Yep.
But so I can understand that, but I can't understand, well, what about the Army Wives Club, Army Officers Wives Club, and the Navy Officers Wives Club, because they had just as much time as the Air Force people did.
Sure.
So where are they in all of this?
Yeah. It's a great question. And right at the origins of this is actually before the Air Force was a separate branch. So in its origins, right, it was embedded. But I mean, part of this, I think, is a story also of what we talk about as historical contingency, meaning that the kind of the specific combinations of any particular place in a specific time, with specific people, right, creates a specific outcome that in a different combination would not have happened. And so I think it had a lot to do with those particular individuals who started it at Wright Pat. And Wright Pat, right, wasn't the only place where Air Force officers' wives existed. It wasn't. It was these individuals in that place. I do think that
they might have felt more excluded or just isolated in Wright Pat than they did in many of the other bases around the United States and in the world.
I don't know. I mean, maybe that no one ever said that, but that doesn't mean that wasn't happening. I do think that there are the Wright Pat version was influenced pretty clearly from, or at least in conversation with a regional variation that existed for a while in Oklahoma. That was actually associated with a bank in Oklahoma. It's very interesting. And I think that there may have been a specific kind of regional connection with one of the founders. And so again, these specific ways that these are come together. But now it really is like a Air Force officers' wives cultural thing. Yeah.
Could it be class-based?
More than the other, I mean, maybe not more than the naval officers' wives. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I do think that obviously like hierarchy and class are all playing a role here, and it's definitely important that it's a game of the officers' wives and not the enlisted.
But the Air Force was new.
Right. It was new. It was new.
It was
that's right.
Navy and Army were playing bridge.
Right.
Our officers' wives and the Air Force are playing something new and international.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's interesting.
Less tradition.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a
tradition
very interesting point. Yeah. Yeah. At the time, they went around scrounging like garage sales and estate sales for these 1920 sets until they got hooked up with Dorothy Meyerson and she started selling them the new sets. Yeah. Yeah.
So I grew up in the suburbs in Portland, in a neighborhood with lots of Jewish families. And it makes me curious about whether these mothers were getting together playing Mahjong. And what do you know about either the prevalence of it in Portland or just in the state of Oregon?
Yeah, good question. So In which decade? So not to pry, but which decade are we talking about? Okay, great, prime time. Sometimes people ask that question and they grew up a little bit later, like in the 70s, and I'm like, well, things are really changing. That's hard for me to predict. But 50s and 60s, I would be surprised if it wasn't there. That doesn't mean that it was universal, right? It's never every single house. And there were class differences within Jewish communities, so that like I knew, thank you. I know a woman whose mom, she was growing up in Detroit, and her mom did not play Mahjong because she felt that they did not, she was very intimidated and felt, I think, class like shamed by these women showing up to her friend's house with the gloves on and, you know, jewelry. And she was like, this does not feel good to me. And therefore I will also judge them. They have too much time on their hands, is what she would say. But the woman hosting that group was her best friend. So it wasn't like there were these, you know, oh, we never talked to each other. It's just that this was a, you know, a divide. And the divides within Jewish communities that came up, it was not consistent or 100% predictable based on class, but if there was going to be a divide, it was often around class. So I would be very surprised if it were not in the suburbs around Portland at the time. Again, to what degree, I don't know. And I don't have a lot of I didn't do a lot of specific research in Oregon. I wasn't living there here at any point in the time that I was doing the research, because I moved here in 2018. And I started researching this in 2009. But the consistency that comes through in so many, I really sought out a lot of different regional variation for talking to people and looking for sources, and it is profoundly consistent. So I assume it was here.
And so I live in a neighborhood here in Cannon Beach that was developed primarily by a Jewish group of friends who lived in Portland as their second home. And Mahjong was part of it.
Great, yeah.
Mahjong to me always has Shanghai in it. And Mahjong was when the Japanese came into Shanghai, Shanghai wasn't Shanghai anymore.
Right.
And I think that changed people's idea of how elegant it was, because Shanghai was in ruins.
Yes.
And the people were all over the place, particularly the expats.
Yeah, no, the Japanese invasion of Shanghai devastated Shanghai, obviously, and also has specific ramifications around Mahjong and the Mahjong industry. I mean, this is also part of when Americans really stopped being able to buy Chinese sets, even though, like I said, the fad years, it was over anyway, but that industry is, you know, I mean, they're in war, they're being bombed. So that's when you start to see some of the first, you know, American, there were American factories during the fad years, but then the sets serving American players that emerged, the factories that emerged later are really, you know, after the invasion of Shanghai, and then with the growth of the league's game.
I bought a set from a widow of an airport officer who served in Japan in 1946, and he had bought it there.
Yeah.
And do you have any idea where it was made?
I'd have to see it. There was a Japanese Mahjong industry by that point, probably. I mean, there definitely was. Yeah, I'm sure there
46,
was.
pretty early.
Yeah. Again, the fad was, Mahjong became a part of Japanese culture in the 1920s too. And so you start to see some Japanese made sets pretty early. They're not making them out of bone and bamboo. Bone and bamboo are basically like Chinese are making bone and bamboo sets. They're making it out of early plastic. So before, everybody calls these Bakelite, it's actually Catalin. Right. Catalin can hold color. But before Bakelite or Catalin, there were cellulose-based plastics and things like that. And so they were making, and French ivory. And so they're making some of those early plastic sets.
So his bone is probably Chinese.
It's probably Chinese, yeah. And they, but what's also true is that, so, you know, I talked about the Air Force officers' wives developing their own specific version of the game, right, Pat Mahjong? But lots of people stationed in Asia then and now are learning Asian styles of Mahjong, whether that's the Philippines or Japan or China. They are learning and playing Mahjong with cross-culturally with people in those communities that are specific to that place. So yeah, there's lots of cultural transfer that happens through the military. I mean, obviously in lots of ways, but Mahjong is one of them. Yeah. I love it. You have great questions. Thanks. That's awesome.
This one's simple. Back in the 1800s in China, when they were first being made, did they ever make the tiles out of ivory?
Great question. So the game becomes known as a game of the ivories. Virtually no tiles were made out of ivory. There were some. Like the Vanderbilts, whatever you mean, like, you know, global royalty, whether you're in Europe or New York or China or wherever, like if you're super elite, you might have an ivory set. But ivory by the 1920s, elephants were already massively overhunted for ivory because of this global ivory trade that had been happening up for a long time. And so they were rare and it was very expensive. But there's a long tradition of ivory carving in China, and that's always been associated with elite people and just beautiful, intricate carving. And so it is highly probable that the first artisans who made Mahjong sets out of bone spliced together with bamboo did so because they were evoking ivory intentionally, because bone you can also make very fine carvings out of. And it looks a lot like ivory. And so this is part of a longer Chinese tradition with using ivory, but then it gets sold, again, part of this eliteness as ivory-like, and people kind of tend to drop the light part and stick with the ivory part. And so many people today think that their set, whether it's made out of plastic or bone, is ivory because it's been called ivory for so long. But the ivory sets do exist, but they are very rare. Yeah, I mean, fortunately, I wish they were rarer, right? I wish that those elephants didn't die. So, yeah, yeah.
What most surprised you when you were doing the research for this?
Oh, good question. Well, the first surprise was about this 1920s craze, that it was, you know, I started with this question of why did Jewish women in the 1950s and 60s play this Chinese game? Why was it known as a Jewish game in the United States? So much so that I've talked to like older Jewish men who did not play the game, because this was a women's game, but were around it, who have said, no, they brought it over from the old country. Mahjong is a Yiddish word. No, it's not. But it's like that, right? It's that embedded. So that's what I started with. And to quickly uncover this enormous wealth of conversation about this game in the 1920s, right? When literal, I mean, there are like dozens of plays, thousands of newspaper articles, image after image after image after image, and it was as though it never happened, right? Like this was virtually entirely forgotten. This was a defining element of American culture, and it had evaporated. And that was very surprising and fascinating. And so there are lots of little surprises, but that was a big one, and it happened right away. Yeah.
Very fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. My pleasure.